Book 3, Chapter 12. The deaths of Tolly Molinari and Frank Falcone, coming as they had on the threshold of what had looked like a lasting peace, sent shock waves through the underworld of the nation. Out of context, anyone would have presumed the crash was an accident. Severe thunderstorm, lake effect air pockets, case closed. The unsolved disappearance of Gerald O'Malley, the crash's lone survivor, aroused suspicion, as did his garbled words to the tower in Cleveland, in which he had apparently wondered if the plane had been sabotaged. Despite this, his voice had remained calm until right before impact, when he shouted, "Sono fottuto!" which the FAA report translated from the Italian as "I'm a goner." Investigators found no clear evidence of sabotage. They attributed the pilot's assertion to his inexperience. They ruled the crash as an accident. Pilot error. It was, by any measure, a meaningless coincidence that the last funeral the four dead men had attended together was that of Vito Corleone. But from the Mafia's murky, contested origins in 19th century Sicily to the present day, every human act, benevolent or violent, willful or inadvertent, whether born of aggression or self-preservation, of passion or ice-cold ragione, becomes part of one vast gossamer web, where no quiver or throb is too small to be felt everywhere. For a Sicilian, whose mother tongue is the only one in the Western world that lacks a future tense, the past and the present are as one. For a Sicilian, whose blood has endured 6,000 years of invasion and occupation, an accident or a coincidence is no more meaningless or meaningful than an act of will. Each may be indistinguishable from the other. For a Sicilian, nothing happens out of context. The Coast Guard rescuers had lashed O'Malley to a bodyboard and raced him to a nearby hospital, where the admitting nurse, referring to the man's Nevada driver's license, which formed the core of the fat wad of bills in his front pocket, logged him in at 10:25 p.m. as Gerald O'Malley, male, Caucasian, age 38. His broken leg was set and put in traction, his broken ribs taped, his other wounds sewn shut. He did not appear to have any serious internal injuries, but there were still tests to run. He remained unconscious, but the long-term prognosis appeared excellent. His condition was upgraded from critical to serious. According to his chart, the doctors finished with him at 4:18 a.m. The final notation on the chart came at 4:30 a.m., though that one seemed likely to have been a fake. Nothing was noted but the time and some illegible initials no one at the hospital could identify. By that time, irregularities in both the flight and the other four bodies, or at least parts of them, had either surfaced on their own or been lifted into the gray light of day by human hands. The bodies had not yet been identified, and the riot of reporters and law enforcement officials that those identifications would trigger was not yet unleashed. The flight plan in Detroit was shown as having been filed, but no one could find it. The plane had left Detroit in the morning and so had to have stopped somewhere else in the 12 ensuing hours. But when the pilot made radio contact with the tower at Burke Lakefront Airport, he indicated he was coming directly from Detroit. The tower tried to get a clarification, but the plane's radio transmissions, probably because of all the lightning, were a roar of static. When it became clear the plane was in distress, attention turned exclusively to bringing it down safely. The meatpacking company whose logo was on the side of the plane was located outside Buffalo, New York. The president of the company, groggy with sleep, at first told the investigator he had the wrong number, that his company had no plane, though when the investigator asked if he was sure about that, the president paused and then said, "Right, our plane," and hung up. By the time other calls were made and the state cops sped out to his lakefront home to bring him in for questioning, he was freshly shaved and showered, dressed in his suit, waiting in his living room, flanked by a lawyer who had once been the state's attorney general. On behalf of his client, the lawyer informed the officers that a week's unlimited use of the aircraft in question had been a gift from his client to his friend Joseph Zallucci, two-time winner of the prestigious Michigan Philanthropist of the Year award and a board member since 1953 of Detroit. Hooray! To aid the transportation of guests to and from his daughter's lovely wedding this past weekend in Detroit, which, owing to a prior commitment, his client had been unable to attend. The client knew nothing about the men and or women on board, or any details about the flight other than what had become public knowledge. The lawyer asked the cops if they had any warrants for either search or arrest, then thanked them for their time and for leaving his client alone so he could begin to mourn this unfortunate tragedy. An attorney for Joseph Zallucci said that Mr. Zallucci knew nothing about the man who had crashed the plane, other than that he was a licensed commercial pilot who worked for a reputable charter company in New York. He'd been hired over the telephone by an associate of Mr. Zallucci. Mr. Zallucci expressed his deep sympathy for the victims and to their families. Gerald O'Malley disappeared from the hospital sometime between 4:18 notation on the chart and about 5, when an orderly walked into the room and found the bed empty and tubes dangling from the devices that had been connected to the patient's arm. The pulley that had been attached to his broken leg was also gone, as were the patient's personal effects. Nick Garacci had been arrested several times, though never convicted, so his fingerprints were on file. But when he arrived at the hospital, there had been no reason to fingerprint him. His room had been wiped clean. The two attending nurses whose responsibility it might have been to check frequently on the man admitted as Gerald O'Malley each claimed that she was certain he'd been assigned to the other. The head nurse would later take full responsibility for the mistake and reassign in disgrace. She moved to Florida and got what was presumably a lower-paying job for a company providing in-home nursing care. Many years later she died peacefully in her sleep. When her will was read, her newly rich children marveled at the savings habit of that generation of Americans forged by the Great Depression. Several law enforcement agencies and countless reporters tried for months to solve the mystery of the missing pilot. All failed. Members of the U.S. Senate, capitalizing on the public's fascination with the case, began to discuss holding hearings on this and other matters related to the growing and perhaps communist menace of organized crime syndicates in America, variously calling such proceedings long overdue, perhaps inevitable, and something we owe to our women and children and, indeed, our way of life. The driver's license wasn't a forgery, but the birth certificate the state of Nevada had on record actually belonged to an infant buried in a New Hampshire cemetery. The information the feds had for O'Malley on his pilot's license led, of course, to that same New Hampshire cemetery. Only God and Tom Hagen knew the rest. The cemetery lay beside a road that, many miles north, became the main drag of the town where Kay Adams Corleone had grown up. Soon after Michael killed his sister's husband and lied to Kay about it, she left him. She took the kids and went to her parents' house. Michael called her only once. A week passed. One morning, Hagen showed up in a limousine. Tom and Kay took a long walk in the woods. Michael wanted her to know that she could have anything she wanted and do whatever she wanted as long as she took good care of the kids, but that he loved her and, in a characteristically labored joke, that she was his Dawn. Hagen relayed this message only after confiding in her about some of the things Mike had done, an act of defiance that might have gotten Hagen killed. But it worked. Kay eventually came home. On Hagen's way back to New York, he stopped at a random public library, leafed through an old volume of the local newspaper, and learned of the sad story of Gerald O'Malley, stricken by diphtheria and taken by the Lord at the age of 11 months. Hagen kept the limo idling out of sight and walked to the courthouse. He was a nondescript man who knew how to behave in a library or courthouse so that people would forget him the moment he left. His various travels had allowed him to collect notarized copies of birth certificates from all over the country, never the same courthouse twice. He had a stack as thick as a Sears catalog. When Garachi asked for one with an Irish name, poor O'Malley's was right on top. Once the identities of the dead were confirmed and then made public, anyone who knew or suspected what Vincent Forlenza was and what sort of situation he had on Rattlesnake Island immediately presumed that the plane had spent the afternoon there. This, with no inkling that the pilot was Forlenza's actual godson. The authorities, of course, could prove nothing. Forlenza, questioned 2 days after the accident, also in the presence of distinguished legal counsel, wondered if the good men of the law might not be watching too much television. Gangsters? On his beloved island sanctuary? Now he'd heard everything. In any case, he'd been home all weekend, except for Sunday afternoon, when the so-called gangsters supposedly landed on Rattlesnake Island to have some kind of, what? Summit? Powwow? No matter. Forlenza said he'd spent the day in question as a guest at a Labor Day clam bake sponsored by one of the union locals, huddled under a big top tent, sipping ice-cold union-made beer and refusing to let the downpour spoil his celebration of an important national holiday, a story corroborated by any number of office-holding Cleveland Teamsters. The physical description of O'Malley the police cobbled together from their interviews with rescue and medical personnel held little promise. They had seen the man's injuries, but not the man. They were more fixated on the patient's vital signs than the size of his ears, the shape of his closed eyes, or the subtleties of the jagged ridge of his much broken nose, which had at any rate been broken again and was too purple and swollen to look much like the way it had. No one outside the Corleone and Forlenza organizations could have guessed that Gerald O'Malley was the same guy as Nick Garachi. No one outside those families knew much about who Garachi was or what he did. His 7 years in the ring, even with all the fixed fights, had rearranged his face enough that boyhood friends would be unlikely to recognize him. He had fought under more fake names than he himself could remember. Boxers become muscle guys every day, and any local muscle guy with half a brain can become a button man. But those guys don't turn into big earners so often, much less into big earners a few courses shy of their law degree. He was known in New York as a guy who'd been under the wing of Sally Tessio, but all the different things he'd done would have made it nearly impossible for anyone to put all the pieces together. The more exceptional a person becomes, the more his place in the world seeks a similar extreme. It becomes more likely that he will be known either by everyone or by no one. He will either stand out, even though most people will never see him in the flesh, or he will vanish, even if he's sitting right next to you at a lunch counter in Tucson, humming the bridge from that new Johnny Fontaine record and tapping a dime on the Formica, waiting to use the payphone. It's a crazy goddamned world. For months, Nick Garachi, or what was left of him, was out there in it, somewhere. Hardly anyone knew where. Hardly anyone was even looking for him. Richard the Ape Aspromonte, who was asked only once by a blind woman how he got that nickname, was buried in Los Angeles, followed by a reception afterward at Gussie Cicero's supper club. When the time came to make toast, all four of Aspromonte's brothers looked at Jackie Ping Pong, who hardly knew the ape, but whose words proved eloquent, moving, and a comfort to the dead man's grieving mother. In San Francisco, Lefty Mancuso's parents tried to keep his funeral small. The only celebrity there was a lesser DiMaggio brother, a high school classmate of Lefty's. The only member of the Molinari family was Tony Molinari's younger brother, Nicodemo. Out of respect, even his bodyguards stay on the periphery, just in front of the small cadre of the cops and the curious. Ordinarily, A don would attend a funeral of such men only if they were close personal friends. But these were not ordinary times, and so it became known beyond their own small circles and throughout the underworld that, as expected, Jackie Ping Pong and Nicodemo Bucci Molinari had each, apparently peacefully, assumed control of his organization. As for Montes and Mancuso's bosses, Frank Falcone and Tony Molinari, were buried the next day. They'd had many common friends, but no one could attend both funerals. A choice had to be made. These choices would be watched. On a walk back and forth past the unfinished houses on Tom Hagen's cul-de-sac, with Al Neri and two others in the car, parked so it blocked off the whole street, Michael Corleone, smoking cigarettes, told Hagen, who was smoking a cigar, only that he should start amassing untraceable cash, in case there was a ransom to be paid. Michael wanted to be protected from knowing exactly where the money came from, and otherwise he needed to protect Hagen from this entire matter. Hagen stopped at the end of the cul-de-sac. At the far end of the street, his boy Andrew, the 13-year-old, ran out of the front door with a football under his arm, then apparently saw Nettie's car, dropped his head in lolling teenage exasperation, and went back inside. Hagen looked past Michael to some vague spot at the saw-tooth horizon, and for a very long time he said nothing. Michael lit another cigarette and said that was just how it had to be. "You wouldn't pay the ransom, though, would you?" Hagen asked. Michael looked at him with obvious disappointment, but only shrugged. Hagen stayed silent for a while longer, then whipped his half-finished cigar across the bright white cement and said, "Protect me," in a way that was neither a plea nor an incredulity, just a statement. Michael nodded. Nothing more was said. Michael summoned Rocco, Clemenza, and Fredo to his home. They huffed upstairs and sat in front of his blonde desk in those orange plastic chairs. He asked point blank if any of them had any idea what happened to Garachi. Each said no with equal vehemence. "It wasn't you?" Rocco asked, and Michael shook his head, and they all seemed surprised. An accident was bad enough, but eventually the people who mattered would learn that the pilot had been Garachi. "Which is when the fan'll hit the shit," Clemenza said. Michael nodded. The only way to fix this mess, he said, was to call a meeting of all the families. The first since the one his father had convened right after Sonny was killed. Admit that this was a dumb decision, trying to go see a boxing match, even if Falcone did not have a big bet on it and pressured him to go. Restitution could be made. All the Dons would give their word that the matter was finished, and it would all be a blessing in disguise because they could go right from that to formalizing a larger peace agreement. Everyone would benefit. Yes, such a meeting would mean that there would be a vote about putting Russo on the commission, but at this point the definitive end to this war would be worth even that. It was going to happen sooner or later anyway. "But the problem we have now," Michael said, "is whatever happened, cover-up, kidnapping, maybe even the government, makes that kind of summit impossible." Clemenza snorted and said he smelled something rotten in Cleveland, and Michael cocked his head. "I seen Hamlet with that fruit. What's his face? The famous one. Not half bad, once you got past the tights." He looked at Fredo, and Fredo said, "What?" And Clemenza shrugged and asked Mike if he figured Forlenza's men sabotaged the plane or if they were trying to keep Garachi's identity secret so that people wouldn't think they'd sabotaged the plane. Since the best way out of this mess would be to point out that the Jew certainly wouldn't sabotage a plane flown by his own godson, which would open up a whole other can of worms. Maybe it was all just a misguided attempt by Forlenza to protect his godson. Maybe even from us. Downstairs, Michael's half-deaf father-in-law had the TV blasting. In a piercing falsetto, little Anthony Corleone sang along to the theme song for a cowboy show. "Jesus, what a gambot," Fredo said. "Makes my head hurt. How many different ways this thing could go?" Michael nodded. so slowly it was clearly a theatrical pause for thought, not agreement. A necessary pause. He was not, so soon after his brother's elevation to Sotocapo, going to disagree with him forcefully, even in front of men as trusted as Clemenza and Lampone. None of this, Michael said, brings us closer to finding out what happened to Garachi. He leaned across his Danish modern desk. It was time to stop speculating, time to get down to business. The next day, Clemenza returned to New York with orders to run his operation as if peace were assured and the crash never happened. His men were to do the same. The day after that, Rocco, who knew the men in Gadachi's crew, also went to New York, where he would remain and oversee those operations until further notice. Fredo, as underboss, would temporarily be in charge of Rocco's men in Nevada. The Corleones had long been close to Tony Molinari, who'd protected Fredo in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on his father and whose cooperation had helped make it possible for the Corleones to establish themselves in Las Vegas and now in Tahoe and Reno. Neither Vito nor now Michael had ever regarded Frank Falcone as a serious person. Neither believed that his flashy, second-rate operation possessed either the means or the will to come out from under Chicago's apron skirts. Michael might have opted to be represented at neither funeral. Many expected him to make just that decision, and, on the face of it, this might have seemed the more cautious and more prudent of choices. But these are only words: caution, prudence, and they are words that can easily be replaced by other words: hubris, fear, weakness. A man is his actions, public and private, both when watched and when alone. Fredo, who after all had been the closest of anyone in the organization to Tony Molinari, was dispatched to San Francisco. Michael, accompanied by Tommy Neri and the same two others who'd been hiding in the woods in Lake Tahoe, went to Chicago, the city where Frank Falcone was born, the city where he'd made his bones, was where his own bones, or whatever remained of them, would be buried. Those who'd known Vito Corleone recognized the logic in Michael's decision. Keep your friends close, the great Don had said, and your enemies closer. The ceremony was held in a tiny white clapboard church on the near west side of the city, in the Italian neighborhood known as the Patch, where Falcone had been raised and where his parents had once run a corner grocery. Hot for Chicago in September. The Chicago police had blocked off traffic for 2 blocks in every direction. Several of the dignitaries, including the Lieutenant Governor of California, the heavyweight champion of the world, and several movie stars, including Johnny Fontaine, received a motorcycle escort right to the back steps. Others, including Michael Corleone, came early enough to take their seats without such ostentation. Out front, the street was packed. Falcone's origins were the stuff of local legend, and although the mourners inside observed a respectful silence, no one among the buzzing horde in the street could have failed to hear someone tell the dead man's story. When Frank was only a boy of 15, his father had closed the store and his older sister was counting the day's receipts when they were both killed in a stick-up, a crime investigated so half-heartedly by the police. "Ain't nothing but doggos killing doggos in Doggo Town," a detective said, laughing, within earshot of Frank and, worse, of Frank's mother, that the boy vowed to get revenge. It didn't take long. Somehow, the kid's passion got him an audience with Al Capone. The thief's corpse was found on the front steps of the precinct station, stabbed, as legend has it, 64 times. Frank's father was 45 years old. His sister was 19. The detective and his partner went on a fishing trip to the Wisconsin Dells and were never seen again. For a time, Frank and his mother ran the store, but the memories were too much. From nowhere, Trapani accent, a buyer emerged and paid a fair price. Frank's mother took that money and the money from selling her house and moved in next door with her brother's family. Frank found employment with Mr. Capone. After Mr. Capone had his problems, Frank pursued other opportunities in Los Angeles. At first, he managed to remain in everyone's good graces by doing well, remembering where he came from, and repaying the men who'd helped him get where he was. These men had enough problems without worrying about everything west of here that was supposed to be Chicago's too, and Falcone was their boy anyhow, always would be. It's hard to say when it happened, but it came to seem as though Falcone had always been the guy out there, his own outfit. Never did get his mother to move, even though he built her a house in the Hollywood Hills, swimming pool, the works. 20 policemen on horseback, every horse in blinders, because of the incessant flashbulbs, cleared a path through the crowd and the funeral procession, many of the cars sporting large campaign signs for the politicians and judges inside, made its way to Mount Carmel Cemetery. Thousands of people followed it on foot. Just inside the main entrance, the procession passed the final resting place of the rotting, syphilitic remains of Al Capone, who died 16 years after the IRS killed him, and whose own anticlimactic funeral had been attended by a fraction of the people here for Falcone's. The Falcone mausoleum was made of black granite and topped with a statue of an angel with a falcon tethered to its right arm. The falcon was taken off, its wings spread wide enough to provide welcome shade for several sweaty bystanders. Falcone's father and sister had not been buried here, but brass plaques on 2 of the doors bore their names. Falcone's mother and his wife and kids sat beside the coffin. The only other person in the front row was Louis Russo, sporting those gigantic sunglasses. The rest of Falcone's blood family sat in the second row, along with Jackie Ping Pong and Johnny Fontaine, who was listed in the bulletin as an honorary pallbearer. Fontaine cried like a woman. The other 49 honorary pallbearers, politicians, police captains, judges, businessmen, athletes, and entertainers, no one from the Chicago outfit or any other organization, were all shown seats near the front as well. Certainly there were people watching Michael Corleone, but, especially in the context of this circus, not many. He was not a famous man, certainly not in comparison with Fontaine, the heavyweight champion of the world, the lieutenant governor of California, or even philanthropist and former ambassador to Canada M. Corbet Shia, row 6, next to Mae West. Michael Corleone was not the target of the photographer's flashes, and only a few of the men from law enforcement knew more about him than the public did, which was not much. He'd been a war hero, but a lot of men had been war heroes. His name had been in the papers during the troubles in New York in the spring, but the pictures of him were blurry, shot at a distance, and the public's memory is shorter than a senile dog's. In his world, Michael Corleone was known by all, but many of those men knew him only by reputation and couldn't have easily connected the name to the face. He knew several of the people here well, but he did not approach them. Somber nods sufficed. Fontaine didn't appear even to notice him. Michael watched the proceedings in silence. Afterward, he stood patiently in line to offer his condolences to Falcone's widow and mother, the only words he said in public all day, then disappeared into the frosty back seat of the humble black Dodge that had brought him. Inside, for the first time, Michael Corleone wept for his dead father. Don Molinari's funeral procession rolled through the fog, a line of more than 100 cars in long, snarling traffic, winding southbound and out of San Francisco. Federico Corleone rode in the 4th car behind the hearse, in a 2-tone Cadillac, black and white, that Tony Molinari used to like to drive himself. Fredo had come alone. He had told Michael that bringing along Capra and Figaro, after all the protection the Molinaris had provided Fredo over the years, would look like disrespect, or worse, like the Corleones had something to fear in San Francisco, and was shocked when his brother had agreed. The driver was a Molinari soldado whose name Fredo was trying to remember. Also up front was Tony's little brother Dino's wife. Her two girls rode in back beside Fredo. It was the longest ride to a graveyard that Fredo could remember ever taking, made longer by the crying kids and the clumsy attempts to console them. He had had the foresight to bring two handkerchiefs, soft silk monogrammed ones that floated from kid to kid until one of them blew her nose so hard she got a nosebleed and had to use both of them to help stop it. "Where is this place?" Fredo asked, reaching for the prayer card that had the name of the cemetery on it. The Italian cemetery. "Colma," said the driver. "You're all in Colma." "Who's all in Colma?" "Where the heck—" He stopped himself. "Where's Colma?" "Cemeteries. They're all illegal in San Francisco. Gotta go to Colma, which we're almost to now. Back in the gold rush days, you buried your people wherever they fell. The garden, backyard, some alley, whatever. There were some cemeteries, mostly for the rich ones. But those got moved to Colma, the bodies. They had to do it. My nana, she still talks about how during the earthquakes all over the city, dead bodies would heave to the surface and come shooting." "Enough," said Dino's wife. "Talk," he said in Italian. "When the chickens piss," meaning shut your damn mouth. The children didn't seem to understand Italian. The driver didn't say another word. Freda supposed that the driver's story wasn't the kind of thing to tell the kids, but they'd both stopped crying and looked pretty interested. Outside, the houses and neighborhoods just stopped, superseded in every direction by undulating plains covered with gravestones, vaults, statues, crosses, and palm trees, a vast, unyielding city of the dead. And for some reason he thought of what his brother Sonny had said when he'd effectively banished Fredo from the family. "Las Vegas is a city of the future." "No, Sonny. This, Colma, is the city of the future. The city of the future. City of the dead. Dead like Sonny." Fredo felt a nervous laugh, the crazy kind, rising in him, and he stifled it. The Italian cemetery stretched for miles along both sides of the road. The procession entered a path on the south side, past a monument that had dozens of green metal hands sticking out, grasping a long black chain. Fredo shook his head in wonder. "This is the greatest racket I ever saw. Of course, there's a cemetery here just for Italians. Before any of this was here, back when you could still plant the dead under your rose bushes, Fredo would bet that this whole place had been bought up quietly by Italians. Land that looks like the Sicilian countryside, where poor farmers struggled to grow grapes and olives until someone came up with the idea for a better crop. You get the papers to run sob stories from doctors talking about health risks. You get an ordinance passed. Presto, you're getting paid twice to bury 100 years worth of people who'd already been buried. Get paid once to dig and move, again for the grave site in Colma. Give jobs to 100 Italian stonecutters who now owe you a favor. Same goes for anyone, really, who needs work and can handle a shovel. Then, for good measure, you buy up the land in San Francisco where the cemeteries were. Prime real estate that comes cheap because it used to be full of corpses. But this is America. No history, no memory. You develop the land, and people line up to buy it. On the back end, you get a piece of everything it takes to keep hauling stiffs down here. Plots, stones, caskets, flowers, limos. All this plus the traditional benefit of being a silent partner in the graveyard business. If the cemetery in Brooklyn that Amerigo Bonazera ran ever got dug up, it'd be kind of like Cracker Jack, a surprise under every box. Colma even sounds Italian. A chill went through him. His solar plexus contracted. He closed his eyes. He could see it. The marshes of New Jersey stretched before him like 10 Colmas. The Corleones had the political clout in New York to get the ordinance passed. The turf battle in Jersey with the Strachys, that could be worked out. He could practically hear Pop's voice. Every man has but one destiny. "You all right?" asked Dino's wife. Fredo opened his eyes. Against the tide of his own elation, Fredo summoned what he hoped was a sorrowful nod. She and the kids piled out of the car. Fredo drained the rest of the whiskey in his flask and hurried to take his place beside the other pallbearers. After the service, everyone drove all the way back to the city and through it, to Fisherman's Wharf, where Molinari's, the best restaurant in the city, had been closed to the public since the employees had heard the news of their boss's death. The moment Fredo stepped out of the car, though, one whiff and it was clear that the staff had not spent the week at home curled under davenports, weeping. The sea breeze throbbed with the aromas of drawn butter and soft-shell crabs and bluefish and broiled lobsters, tubs of boiling marinara sauce, newly built oak-fired grills crowded with filet mignon that the best meat cutters on the West Coast had competed to donate. Children, dozens of them, sprinted from cars to the back of the restaurant, where a prep chef waited, not with scraps, as they must have ordinarily received, gleaming steel buckets crammed with fresh sardines for the kids to drag out to the end of the pier and whip into air fish by fish, detonating an explosion of beating wings, a rolling blur of gulls and pelicans. As Fredo lingered outside, watching, the birds swarmed over the unsupervised children like a shrieking biblical plague. This would have terrified Fredo as a child. His sister Connie? Forget it. She'd still be screaming. Mike would have sat on one of the pilings, watching the squandering of good sardines in silent condemnation, his hands clamped over his ears. Sonny chucking rocks, not sardines, unless he'd somehow found a gun, which he would have. Hagen would have been dying to shoot the birds too, but he'd never have risked Pop's disapproval and would have watched the whole thing through the car window. But these kids just jumped around on the pier laughing, their faces lit up as though they'd been handed the keys to Coney Island. Even some of the gulls started dive-bombing the buckets. The kids just found it hilarious. It wouldn't be long before some adult ruined things, told them to simmer down and show some respect for poor Uncle Tony. Sure enough, a moment later, someone stout and scowling Zia came bustling toward them. Fredo couldn't bear to watch and turned to face the black ribbons on the restaurant door. It was at any rate time for him to do what he'd come here to do. He'd have rather gone back to his hotel room and thought about how to present his Colma East plan to Mike. If he were honest with himself, which he was not quite drunk enough to be, he might have allowed himself to think of other places the day and the night might take him, but he would not let himself think of that. Instead, he took a deep breath and went inside. Under any circumstances, Molinari's was a dark restaurant with black cypress plank walls, black leather booths, and red curtain windows, drawn on every side but the one that faced the bay, where often the only light was a fog-defeated pallor. Today, even those curtains were closed. The usually dim lighting was even lower, the candles were smaller, and the room was filled shoulder to shoulder with dark-haired, olive-skinned people dressed in black. The brightest things in the room were the tablecloths, starched so impossibly white that Fredo found himself squinting. Standing in the middle of the restaurant's famous marble fountain was a life-size ice sculpture of Tony Molinari, its hand extended toward the bar. People kept reaching across the water and touching its forehead. The crowd was bigger than the one at the cemetery, something that anyone who took a bite of anything could have explained. Fredo made his rounds, embracing people and shaking his head about the tragedy and the terrible waste of it all. A few people made cryptic allusions to his promotion to underboss, and Fredo thanked them and said, "You know, a man's gotta eat," and then ate. He drank beer so he wouldn't get drunk. He lacked the charisma his father and brothers had, but as he'd grown older, he'd realized that for that very reason he was better at this kind of thing than they were. He intimidated no one. He was so frankly awkward that women wanted to mother him. Men would see him hovering at the edge of their conversation, hand him a drink, and bring him up to speed on the story they'd been telling. He'd reciprocate, drink with him once, and until the end of time, Fredo Corleone would remember your poison. He thrived during his years of exile on the hotel side of the casino business because he genuinely liked to see people enjoying themselves, not just because then they'd owe him a favor. Around the other Corleone men, people behaved like robots, silently rehearsing each word before they dared to speak. Around Fredo, they could be themselves. People liked him. He knew people saw this as a weakness, but that's where they were wrong. There was no greater natural advantage in life than having your enemy overestimate your faults, Pop had said. Not to him, true. To Sonny. Pop had given Sonny lessons, a lot of times with Fredo sitting right in the room, totally ignored. Sonny heard. Fredo listened. The room buzzed with speculation about the missing charter pilot known as O'Malley, and people opened up to Fredo about it as they never would have to Mike. He heard every theory under the sun, the most frequent being either that O'Malley was some kind of undercover cop or else that he was somehow connected to the Cleveland family. Both, maybe. But the higher-ranking men had other ideas. Bucci Molinari, for example, as he released Fredo from his embrace, merely whispered, "It's fuckface, no?" As he had all day, Fredo said he had no idea whatsoever, which was also something Mike could never have pulled off. Why did he do this to himself? This endless comparison with his brothers. Fredo stood in front of the gilded mirror in the men's room. He stood up straight and sucked in his gut. His eyes looked like, how did that song go? 2 cherries in a glass of buttermilk? His brothers, he was sure, didn't waste time comparing themselves with each other, and certainly not with him. He ran his hands through his thinning hair. He'd had enough to drink, that was for sure. He looked at his round face and tried not to see in it the traits he'd inherited from his parents. The stronger version of his jawline that Sonny had, the eyes that were just like Mike's, only closer together. He picked up the glass jar full of combs and tonic and smashed it against his own reflection. Green liquid rained everywhere. The mirror only cracked. Fredo handed C-notes to the man at the sink next to him and to the Negro attendant, who said he understood. We all loved Mr. Tony. Fredo headed through the nearly empty restaurant, past the ice sculpture of Tony Molinari, its forehead gruesomely melted, as if it had taken a hollow point slug instead of 1,000 loving caresses, and out the door into the cool dark, determined to be nobody at all, not even himself. He ignored the men at the cab stand and, head down, continued down the wharf. It wouldn't be long, he knew, before the neighborhood turned rough, before he got to the bar full of stevedores and sailors and the back alley bars that only the most depraved of men knew about. He stopped himself. No, not again. Ahead was Powell Street, a straight shot to his hotel. A long walk, but it do him good. Clear his head. He looked toward the gloomy distant lights of those bars, then up Powell Street. He was pretty sure it went by that old Italian neighborhood, North Beach. He could stop there, take a break, have a coffee, think this coma thing through. It would be nice just to take it. The second he turned up Powell, he felt a wave of self-congratulatory relief. By the time he climbed the first big hill, though, he was sweating and having second thoughts. He was too winded to think about his plan or anything else except that he didn't want a coffee anymore. He wanted something cold, even a beer. What could it hurt? The street leveled out. The businesses started to have Italian names, but something was wrong. The streets were full of dirty-looking kids in sweaters and dungarees, some of them Negroes, hardly any of them looking especially Italian. He tried to remember when was the last time he'd been down here. 47? 48? He looked down Vallejo and saw the coffee shop he was thinking of, smelled it a block away, and it still had the same name, Café Trieste, which he took as a sign. Have the coffee, not a drink. But when he opened the door, he caught sight of a red-headed white kid playing the bongos while a Negro in a black sweater stood next to him shouting who the fuck knew what. It was hard to make out over the shouting and finger-snapping of the people at the tables. Mulberry-eyed girls, the man might have said. Mint jelly. Turtle-like angel guys. Fucking bohemians. He left. Somewhere in the city was a very tall whiskey and water with Fredo Corleone's name on it. He stopped in at another Italian place he remembered, Enrico's, which looked about the same except for the sign outside saying, "Live jazz tonight." Bohemians here too, but the music sounded better. So fuck it. He paid his $3 and took a seat at the bar. Piano, soprano sax, and a drummer with brushes. Crazy stuff, but Fredo got his drink and bobbed his head along with the syncopated beat. He was the only one in the room in a suit, which for some reason seemed to provoke people into coming up to him and talking to him about the scene and telling him about the wonders of reefer. He resisted the impulse to tell him he'd just come from the funeral of the guy who'd made most of the profit off their precious reefer. After another drink, he started thinking this combo was about the best goddamn thing he ever heard. Before long, he was at a table with a big group of people, men and women, even smoking some reefer when it came his way. The band took a break, and a fat Norwegian in a fez took the stage and said that after the intermission he'd read his haikus and the combo would jam along. Fredo felt a hand on his arm. It was a long-faced man with long sideburns, about 30, in a sweater and taped together eyeglasses. "I hear you're with a record label," the man said, practically blushing. "That's what you hear, huh?" Fredo dimly remembering having told this lie when he'd first sat down at the table. "I got a band that plays here tomorrow," the man said, and started describing his music in what was probably English. More gibberish. Turtleneck angel guy, Fredo thought. He looked him up and down. A fag, no question. "I'm Dean," the man said. "I like your suit." "Pleasure, Dean," said Fredo. "Sit down, huh? The name's Troy." The search for the missing pilot ended several weeks later, when a body was found at the bottom of a ravine by the Cuyahoga River, not far from the hospital, wedged in a sewer grate. Sewage and rushing water had accelerated decomposition. What remained had been feasted upon by river rats. The face and eyes were completely gone, and when the body was first lifted, live rats slithered out of its mouth and rectum. The admitting bracelet, Gerald O'Malley, male Caucasian, age 38, and what was left of the gown were deemed authentic. The coroner ruled that the body's injuries were consistent with the ones the pilot had suffered, right down to the distinct stitching style of his ER surgeon. Dental records might have been helpful, but the authorities had no idea who Gerald O'Malley had really been. Whoever he was, however he got from the ICU to the bottom of that ravine, the poor fellow was really most sincerely dead.